Welcome to Fantasy Football Today Dynasty. I am your host, Heath Cummings, and we've got something new for you today. I'm calling it the one-man mailbag. Let's try to say that again. The one-man mailbag. And yes, that's right. It will just be me answering your questions today. I've kind of thought about this. If we could add a second episode during the season, this is probably the way I'd want to do it, where I just take 25, 30 minutes, answer as many of your questions as I can. If you're somebody who asks questions in the chat and you don't feel like you get your question answered, this is going to be your best opportunity. I'll get to as many chat questions as I can. I've got some emails. I've got some tweets. Get your questions in the chat now. We'll answer those later. Let's start with the question that everyone is asking. You know, in redraft, there's this just melancholy about the state of the wide receiver position. We drafted wide receivers earlier than we ever had before, and they all just keep getting injured, including this week. We lost Brandon Aiyuk for the season. We lost Chris Godwin for the season. Dynasty managers want to know, what do we do with these situations? What's the value of Brandon Aiyuk moving forward in a trade? San Fran asks on Twitter, what can I ask for if you are contending or if you are rebuilding? And I think it's a good point, because if I'm contending, I am probably selling these guys, and these are probably the guys that if you are rebuilding, you should be buying. But it could also be a situation, especially with an Aiyuk or a Godwin, where you're kind of heading into a rebuild and you thought, well, next year I might be a contender. And we don't know that either Brandon Aiyuk or Chris Godwin are going to be the guys they've been next year in their first year coming off injury. We've seen Godwin in particular impacted by the injury for the first half of a season and not delivering on what we were expecting from him. So I kind of went and took a look. I generally update my dynasty rankings the day after I do this show. But I thought with the wide receivers in particular, I need to get these spots updated. We can talk about trade value. And so I've got 3 wide receivers who are out for the year: Rashee Rice, Brandon Aiyuk, Chris Godwin. The obvious difference here, age. At the beginning of this season, Rice was 24 years old. Aiyuk was 26 years old. Godwin was 28 years old. I've got Rice right now at wide receiver 33. If I was a contender wanting to move him to a contender, I would be targeting a Deebo Samuel, who's 4 years older, a DJ Moore, who's 3 to 4 years older. That type of wide receiver 2 with potential wide receiver one upside rest of season from a guy that you've probably got 2 to 3 years left. That's what I'd be looking for Rashee Rice. Again, wide receiver 33. If you are wanting to trade a draft pick for it, I'm still giving up a first for Rice, but it's got to be a late first. I've got to be, I wouldn't want to be a contender, and that doesn't really make a lot of sense probably to be making that trade as someone who's dealing away picks, unless you are our next tweet. And we'll get to that in a moment. Brandon Aiyuk, I've got 7 spots behind Rice at wide receiver 40. These seem probably like big discounts. But again, we've got uncertain 2025s for all 3 of these guys. Rice because of the suspension, Aiyuk because of the timing and severity of his injury. I think a really interesting idea, if you are a real true contender, is dealing someone like Aiyuk for a Cooper Kupp or a Terry McLaurin. Kupp could be an absolute league winner. We're expecting him back on Thursday. Wouldn't be that surprising if he's a top 15 wide receiver. It is a little bit risky because he's coming off of an injury himself. The safer option with less upside would be someone like Terry McLaurin. And then Godwin's the one that really gets buried here. We're entering his age 29 season. He's wide receiver 58 for me. I would settle for, as a contender, an Amari Cooper or a Stephon Diggs. Again, somebody that you might just have 1 year left. I don't know for sure how many elite years of Chris Godwin we're going to have left. So just something to keep in mind. I wouldn't bank on him being what he was this year in 2025. And then we had a question also from AJ Snap. He says he's a rebuilder with no vets left to sell, but he has 4 firsts, 3 seconds, 3 thirds, and 226 firsts and seconds. So this is how you rebuild. He's got all the picks. He's wondering, should I move some of these picks for young injured stars like Aiyuk and Rice? And obviously we just talked about it. Rice younger than Aiyuk. Maybe not quite as proven as a star, but for fantasy purposes, as Patrick Mahomes' number 1 wide receiver, I think most people are going to still prefer Rice. Again, if you have 4 firsts and you're a rebuilder, Hopefully a couple of those firsts, well, hopefully they're not, but they're probably a couple of those firsts are from guys who are true contenders this year, picks 10 through 12 in the draft. I would give up one of those firsts for Rice and feel really good about it. I'd probably feel better about it with a 2025 first than a 2026. For Aiyuk, I'd be willing to give up 2 seconds. If you wanted to give up one 2025 second, one 2026 second, I'm not giving up a first for Aiyuk right now. And then I would just simply offer a second for Godwin if you wanted to. But as someone who's rebuilding, again, not sure what we're getting from Godwin next year, and then he's looking like an age 30 wide receiver, I'd be less likely to send draft picks as a rebuilder for Godwin than I would be for Aiyuk or Rice. We do have some new people since I last said this. So I just want to say today is a one-man mailbag show. We'll be answering your questions on Patrick Mahomes, Tucker Kraft, contenders pushing in, and of course, buy lows and injury buys for rebuilders. We're also going to answer a lot of your chat questions, which means you need to get your chat questions in. I didn't even realize this was an available option, but you can actually star your comments, and Nada does a great job of starring the comments. So I will have some questions to answer once we get through the emails and the tweets. I wanted to tell you also, this is not like something that's going to replace what FFT Dynasty has been. This will remain predominantly an interview show where we're bringing different guests on. We have Jeff Bell from Football Guys next week. For November, we're working on Theo Grimminger, Adam Pfeiffer, Matt Donnelly, all guys who have been on the show in the past. Of course, Dan and Jacob will be hopping in regularly as well. If you have a guest that you would like to hear from that's in the Dynasty community, especially if I've not had them on before, send your email to fantasyfootball@cbsi.com. I will get to that, take a look at the suggestions, reach out to them. And also, I'd like to hear from you after this show's over. What do you think of the format of the one-man mailbag? And if we did a second show during the season and this type of format, maybe on a Friday, that'd be something that would interest you. Also, that same email address is where you can send your questions, which is what Chris did. He said, what do you think is Mahomes' dynasty value? The Chiefs can't figure out how to trade for a good wide receiver. They finally drafted well with Rice, but he's hurt, now maybe suspended. Kelsey's getting old. Is Mahomes a multi-year rebuild QB, or is he a good buy low fantasy QB? We also had a buy low question, and we'll talk about Mahomes during that as well. I do think he is probably a buy low, but I have dropped him a lot. Like, this was a guy who was my QB1 for most of 2024 coming into the season. I still think he has the upside and the longevity that caused him to be ranked there, but I don't have much hope at all that he's going to be even a top 15 fantasy quarterback for the rest of this year. That drops him all the way to QB6 in my QB rankings. He would be higher than that if you were someone who's not contending this year, but 100%, I still view him as a buy low. This is still a Chiefs offense that whenever they really have to go get points, can go get points. I expect we will see better from Patrick Mahomes, and we will see elite from Patrick Mahomes in the future. Let's take our first break. We'll get to some more of your emails, tweets, and of course, chat questions.
I feel so alive. Who will cement their name in history as the first ever Summer Cup champion? Trust me, we're just getting started. Find out Friday on CBS Sports Network and streaming live on Paramount Plus.
Love some of these questions. And I'm actually going to ask you guys as I go through a lot of these, like for your input, because we've got some questions on who favorite buys are for contenders or rebuilders. So if you have those, when I get to those questions, give me your answers. You might have a better answer than I do on some of those. Got a question from Jake. He wants to know if he made a mistake, traded away Tucker Kraft for Ben Sinnott earlier this year. And now, of course, Kraft has performed like a top 12 tight end, and Sinnott remains stuck behind Zach Ertz. And I think this one really, like, my opinion of Sinnott hasn't really changed that much. This is pretty much what I expected when they signed Zach Ertz. And the reason the transition really happened last year was because Ertz got hurt. And so I think as long as Zach Ertz stays healthy this year, we're not going to see much from the rookie tight end, but we really shouldn't expect to see much from most rookie tight ends. We've been spoiled by Brock Bowers and Sam LaPorta over the last couple of years. I've not downgraded Sinnott. He's still a top 20 tight end for me. That the way I would value Kraft versus Sinnott is that if I was a rebuilder, I'd still prefer to have the rookie. But if I'm a contender, I much prefer to have Kraft. So if you traded away Kraft in this deal and you were a contender, then yes, I think you made a mistake. If you're rebuilding, I think it's still going to work out okay. I do have Kraft ranked higher, but when it really is just dependent on whether you are playing for the future or you're playing for right now. Let's get to some questions from contenders. We had a tweet from Parker Hillman. Does it make sense to sell draft picks in 26 and 27 for a win now roster? At what point does it make sense and when does it not? And I think this brings up a good point. Like if you're a rebuilder, a lot of times it makes sense to target the 26 and 27 picks from contenders because we're not as certain that those are going to be bad picks. And that's the thing I want to be really careful with. If I'm pushing all in, I'm almost always comfortable trading this year's first. I am much more skeptical about trading future first. It really has to be a situation where you got a couple of like super teams pushing all in and you're really trying to win it all this year. Then maybe, but I want to make sure, like I've got a couple of contender teams that have a lot of James Conner and Aaron Jones and Travis Kelce and Cooper Kupp. If I've got teams like that are really in it this year and could win it all, but could absolutely turn to dust by the time we get to the start of 2025 season, there's no way I'm trading those 2026 and 2027 first. Flags do fly forever, but rebuilds can be absolutely miserable if you've traded away all your future picks and then your team face plants. So just be really careful with that. If you've got a real true contender and it's a team that has young studs, then I'm much more comfortable with giving away those future picks, especially if you're in an arms race with one, maybe two other super elite teams. We got another contender here. Jay Cantu has both Devontae Adams and Garrett Wilson. I've got a dynasty league where I have Devontae Adams and Garrett Wilson. He wants to know if he should trade Adams to the Jets fan in his league for Cooper Kupp. I think always a good idea to target fandom with your trades. Looking at my most recently updated dynasty wide receiver rankings, I actually do have Kupp at wide receiver 41. I've got Adams at wide receiver 52. So I do prefer Kupp over Adams. I also think, like we talk a lot about stacking and whether it's good or bad in redraft or during the season. And you got to really be careful when you have a couple of wide receivers on the same team, because you're definitely like giving yourself a little better floor unless the quarterback gets hurt, and then you have a worse floor. And you're always limiting your upside when both of those two guys are healthy. It's hard to have two monster games. I would trade Adams for Cooper Kupp just in a vacuum, and I would definitely do it in this situation where you also have Garrett Wilson. I think you're really increasing your upside, and probably the floor stays just about the same because of the age of Adams and Rodgers. Yes, you're taking on a little bit more risk with Cooper Kupp's injury history, but there's quite a bit of risk already on the Jets. We had a question. I love this question from Taylor Croman on Twitter. Not a question, just says, long-term stashes. Excellent. Long-term stashes is a great topic for discussion. I'd be curious from the chat, who are you guys looking at as long-term stashes? And I'd be curious really what Taylor meant by this question. That's why I've got a lot of names, because you could look at the high-end guys, and at quarterback, for instance, two guys who just don't have any value this year, but are certainly long-term stashes. JJ McCarthy, Michael Penix. Now, in Superflex rookie drafts last year, they were also guys who were either first-round picks or very early second-round picks. And so they're not someone you could add and stash for a long term. If you're looking for one of those, I would be looking at Jordan Travis. We also had a buy low question, dynasty buy low candidates. And I think there's a lot of crossover between long-term stashes and buy lows. Guys who have been injured for the rest of the season, obviously, Rice, Aiyuk, Godwin, we talked about them. They qualify as both long-term stashes and as dynasty buy lows. Godwin, not as much long-term, but still you get the point. But still, I don't really view McCarthy as lost as much value as perception-wise he probably has. So I would, and Superflex would still give up a late first for him, definitely an early second, and I'd be glad to give up a second for Michael Penix. So you can maybe add one of those guys that hasn't produced when we shouldn't really have thought they were going to have produced yet. But maybe get those guys at a little bit of a discount, or go add Jordan Travis maybe. Running backs, I've got Tyjae Spears, Trey Benson. Those are a little bit more obvious. Kamani Vidal, Audric Estime, and then Keaton Mitchell starting to work his way back from injury. Has a couple of older running backs, one of whom is just the greatest running back ever, maybe Derrick Henry. Good gosh, was he awesome last night. Looked dumb on that one. But still, Mitchell, if you remember how explosive that guy was last year whenever he touched the football, definitely someone that if he's on the waiver wire, I would want to make sure that he was rostered at least. I wouldn't give up too much in a trade. We said Troy Franklin as a potential long-term. And I tell you what, I was encouraged by his usage last week. I say, yes, he is. I love Franklin coming into the year, hated the way that Sean Payton used him the first month of the season, but he's a rookie wide receiver. We shouldn't really be that surprised that happened. I'm wondering if it's not entirely long-term. There's at least a small chance that Franklin's the best Broncos wide receiver rest of season. Make sure he's rostered and offer a third and then see. We got a Jalen Tolbert, maybe. Yeah, I think he has looked good. Again, another guy who I think in a pinch you can start as a wide receiver 3. So long term, if something happened to Lamb, and he's about the only wide receiver who's stayed healthy this year, that's somebody that you could look at. I would also say at wide receiver, Marquise Brown. I think people have pretty much forgotten about him. We don't really expect him to play again this year, but maybe gets another prove-it deal in a good situation. A.D. Mitchell is a stash, according to Tony in the chat. 100% agree. I really screwed up a couple of weeks ago when I had Matt Waldman on. He wanted to talk about Mitchell, and we didn't get to him. But if you look at his separation score, you look at his catchable target rate, I really don't think we have any reason to be discouraged by the start for Mitchell and the lack of production, especially when you were looking at like catch rate and stuff like that. It looks awful. I don't think very much of that is his fault. We got another buy low / long-term stash kind of combo platter here, and it's just the rookie tight ends. We already talked about Ben Sinnott. Eric Alls looked good, but not really produced. Jatavian Sanders just had a good target game. Theo Johnson should have just had a touchdown. And then Jared Wiley, there was talk before the season that they really do see him as kind of like, I know Noah Gray's doing things as the tight end 2 in that offense right now, but I think when Kelsey is gone, we're going to see a little bit more from Jared Wiley. So any of those rookie tight ends I'd be buying. Another one that's interesting is I really want to watch what happens with Mike Evans and his timeline, because we are in a situation now with Godwin out. And I don't know how many of you saw my tweet last night, but if you go look at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers schedule, they've got a bye in week 11, and I'm just going to pull it up because it is a fantastic schedule in almost every way for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They have the Giants in week 12, the Panthers in week 13, the Raiders in week 14. Chargers are a bad matchup. Then the Cowboys, then the Panthers again in the fantasy playoffs. There's a chance, and we'll have to see what the timeline is for Mike Evans. There's a chance that he, misses a month and then comes back behind pace on that, 11 straight years now of 1,000 yards. So kind of needing to make up ground on the 1,000 yards, which we know he cares about. And then also we don't have Godwin. So let's see what we find out. I wouldn't be disappointed at all in buying low in Mike Evans, Isaiah Pacheco. We mentioned Patrick Mahomes, who I think is a good one. Also, Justin Herbert is still a very good quarterback. Eventually he's going to have wide receivers and get to throw more again. So I would like to buy low on Justin Herbert. Still think Evan Ingram's probably a top 12 tight end for the rest of the year. So I would buy low on Evan Ingram as well. Let's get to some of your chat questions. And Robert, I would love to have the answer to this one. Great question from Robert in the chat. Why is Sam LaPorta not performing? It's hard to understand. The guy catches nearly every ball thrown to him, and it's true. I think we've had a couple of things. One, Jamison Williams emerged for a couple of weeks and played a bigger role. Two, the Lions have gone extremely heavy in terms of run rates. They now have the 5th highest run rate in the league at 50%. And so there's just not as many passes for Jared Goff. Now, he's been really, really exceptionally efficient. Goff has, playing great football, but there's not that many targets to go around. And Amon-Ra St. Brown's going to get his. They're going to throw to the running back still as well. I do think the suspension for Williams could maybe set LaPorta free. Mostly, I think we just have to stick with him. We've seen it the last couple of weeks from Mark Andrews kind of coming around. I think eventually we get that from LaPorta as well. There was the debate at the beginning of the season. Is it LaPorta or McBride as Dynasty tight end one? Well, now it's obviously Bowers, and I would still prefer McBride over LaPorta, but I'm not selling low on Sam LaPorta. I still think he's very good. I think he has a volume problem. Parker asks, is Fields worth buying in Dynasty for upside? What would you offer in Superflex? I've had this. I hope he's listening. These trade negotiations going on in our Baked Burger Dynasty League. I have Justin Fields. Somebody else has Russell Wilson. We've both been trying to buy the other one cheaply from each other. Nobody's budging. I'm not selling Justin Fields cheap. I do think he's definitely a buy. We might have to wait a couple more weeks for Russ to secure this job, though, because there's always a lot of skepticism around Russell Wilson. One fantastic game probably isn't going to convince everybody that he's starting the rest of the year. And I don't think Fields' price dips until people buy that. So I'd maybe like to wait a couple of weeks unless I could get Fields for a second. And I'd be happy to give up a second for Justin Fields right now in Superflex. Enormous upside. Still a top 12 QB on a per game basis. The Steelers might have two of those this year. Dan asks, would you try to turn Pitts into Kittle and a pick as a contender? 100% yes. I do still value Pitts over Kittle in Dynasty because of the age, but if you're a contender, you should prefer Kittle. I'm not sure how much of a pick you're going to get, but it's going to be better for you this year. Kittle right now projects for me as the number one tight end over the rest of the season. Sebastian asks, what are you willing to pay for Ken Walker today? He offered a first, it's a 1 QB league, and DJ Moore. Would that cut it? I think that should get you very close. I've not fully updated the Dynasty running back rankings for this week, but Ken Walker is knocking on the door of a top 5 Dynasty running back. He might already be there. He's shown us everything we needed to see this year in terms of his work as a pass catcher. He's been excellent as a rusher. The new regime absolutely loves him. If he can stay healthy, he's a league winner for the next 5 years, potentially. But still, a first and DJ Moore seems like a pretty decent offer. I also wouldn't blame the person that has him if they wouldn't take that. I wouldn't hesitate to throw in a second in that deal as well. Tony is in the middle of the standings with Puka, McCaffrey, Richardson, Mahomes. Is it time to look to next year or try to climb in the standings when Puka and McCaffrey come back? And we had some questions from rebuilders as well about like, when is the time to start buying or selling? And I'm kind of still in a holding pattern right now. That Baked Burger Dynasty League I talked about, I'm 4-3 in that league with Cooper Kupp and Nico Collins coming back, hopefully. Still only have Drake May and Gardner Minshew as my quarterback. So that's a bit of a problem, but right in the hunt. And I'm just kind of writing it out. And in this situation, especially with McCaffrey and Puka both potentially coming back, if you're in the middle of the standings without those guys, I'm waiting to the deadline just to see if I can be a contender. Robert asked, is Nico Collins the best wide receiver going forward? So rest of season, I think he's in the conversation. Dynasty, I had him coming into this week at wide receiver 8. If you told me for sure he was playing this week, he might be as high as wide receiver 6. He is definitely a number 1 Dynasty wide receiver. He is not the number 1 Dynasty wide receiver. Ben asks, what do contenders do with Dalton Kincaid? Again, one of those situations where if I could get Kittle and a pick, I'd be really happy to do that. I do still prefer Kincaid. I'm probably starting him. But if I could get an Evan Ingram, or I'd rather have David Njoku to start, not getting rid of Kincaid, but just trying to add those guys maybe for a second, I might start those guys or at least play the matchups there. But trading Kincaid for Kittle and a pick, I think, maybe makes the most. Cousin Ernest, my wife's so mad at me. No, I do not have my Halloween costume picked out. I think we're going to probably end up just falling back on the Kelsey and Taylor Swift thing. And I know it's like, can you do the same costume 2 years in a row? Well, I think everybody's pretty surprised that they were actually together for 2 Halloweens. So maybe just kind of a celebration of them beating the odds. They had everything stacked against them. Would you drop Jalen Tolbert for Kamani Vidal or Cedric Tillman? We had some questions about what Tillman's value is. I'd call him a must-add. I'm not sure I'm ready to drop Tolbert for him. It probably depends on whether or not I need to start one of these guys. I do have a little bit more excitement about Tillman's potential upside, but there's also a good chance that Jerry Jeudy is actually the number 1 wide receiver, and this was just a blip. Is McMillan worth buying? What would you offer? I would give a second. I think this week I have him projected as a number 4, but if Evans is out for a month and he pops this week, we might really quickly view Jalen Mcmillan as a borderline number 2 wide receiver, and he had a great camp. The team loves him. These wide receivers just continue to get older on the team. I'd be happy to offer a second there and see if you could get that done. I've got a couple more questions here. You guys did a great job of filling up the chat with these questions. I really do appreciate it. And my voice even held up, so I appreciate that as well. Half PPR dynasties, 5-2. Considering trading Rashee Rice and a 3rd-round pick for Rachaad White, Cade Otton, and Ray Davis. I really like Otton. Obviously, without Godwin, his target share should go up. He's a top 5 tight end for me this week, top 10 probably rest of season. I think I want a little bit more than that if I'm trading away Rashee Rice. I don't have a great deal of confidence that Rachaad White is going to be a must-start running back, and I don't want to give Rice up if I'm not getting somebody that I really think could win me my league. I did my first ever dynasty draft last night. I have no idea what I'm doing. Any basic tips? Yeah, I think this is a game where like the most important thing, and it's true in redraft too, but know when to react and go that direction confidently. So like you can say, I'm going to wait just a little bit longer to see if this is real. When we have these breakout performances or when guys start to look like they've gone over the hill, but whatever you do, like don't hedge. You either say, I believe, and I'm going to take the long view, or react and go that way aggressively. The other thing I would say is try to stay out of the middle. We had some conversation about, I have a team that's in the middle. Some people are in the middle trying to decide what to do. I would really like to know at the beginning of the season, am I a contender or am I a rebuilder? And really aggressively, again, work that direction as the season goes on. We got one more question here. Let's see what is my team good for. Let's get a shout out to Game Over, putting the 8-man league question in here. People sometimes are like, oh, what are you in an 8-man league? Those leagues are hard. I never know who to start. 10-team leagues are hard enough for me. He wants to know if his team's good for an 8-man league. So you've got Lamar Jackson, who is my number 1 quarterback. You've got a combination of the 49ers running backs. That's fantastic. Tony Pollard. Debo might be a top 10 wide receiver, and Amon-Ra St. Brown. Yes, very good, even for an 8-man league. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. I want to thank you guys for filling up the chat during the mailbag. Again, email us at fantasyfootball@cbsi.com. Tell me your thoughts on the 1-man mailbag, whether you'd like to hear more of them in the future. Thank you to Nada. We will talk to you next Tuesday with Jeff Bell.